Hi there. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Beowulf and the date that we give to Beowulf. I've seen some online exchanges among my students and had some conversations with them lately that it's easy for people to become confused about this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the relationship between Beowulf and Christian elements in Beowulf. And this is an enormously complicated topic, and I'm going to give you a simple version of it, as simplified as I can. So, if you are currently in another class and you watch this video and then you mention it to your professor, and your professor says, well, he's really oversimplified XYZ issue, your professor's right. I am very much simplifying this. If, on the other hand, you see somewhere some unattributed website making some claim, don't pay attention to them. Pay attention to me. So, in order to get through this, I want to distinguish between three different things. One is Beowulf as a story. Where does the story itself come from? The next one is Beowulf as a poem. That is, we start with the story, and then we transform that into a poem. So let's imagine that an event happens in your life, and you tell your friend about it. You telling that story to your friend, that's the story. Let's say your friend decides to make a humorous little poem about it. That poem, the writing of that poem itself, is different, will have a different and later date by necessity than the story. So we have the story, we have the poem, and the third thing we have is the manuscript. The manuscript means the one particular artifact we have in which the poem comes to us. Okay? So let's say that your friend copies this down many times and he loses his original draft of it, but you still have a copy of the poem. That's the manuscript. And so the story must always predate the poem, and the poem must always predate the manuscript. It's impossible to think of a situation where we have a manuscript first of a poem, and then the poem is composed afterward. Unless you have time travelers, that's not going to happen. So, how old is the story? Well, this is really super complicated. We know that in the 6th century, the 500s, some of the characters in Beowulf are real historical people, and they lived. And so at least some parts of the story itself must date back at least as far as the 6th century. Now, what about Beowulf himself? He could date back farther and then have been grafted onto historic events. Some scholars think he might be a kind of archetypal bear's son character, for example, very old. And we've seen this is not the only place this happens. So, for example, King Arthur's stories, in the story of Tristan and Isolde, later on, Tristan ends up as a knight in Arthur's court. Sort of an older story gets grafted onto a newer story. It's also possible that the story of Beowulf himself might possibly be younger than the story of Hrothgar and Hygelac and those figures, and instead the historic figures begin, and then later on, later legends that come up get grafted onto them. We don't know, but we do know that at least some parts of the story must date back to around the 6th century because that's when certain people lived. Okay, so that's the story. So then when is the poem itself composed? Well, the poem itself, there is some debate among scholars in this, and I'm going to give you a 9th century, the middle of the 800s date for this. Some scholars would put it much later. There are other scholars who put it in other times, but pretty much around there. And so if we take this date, what is the situation with the Anglo-Saxons? Well, by this time, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity really begins around 600 AD. So it's been a couple of centuries. Now, the Danes, who are the subject of the story, they are definitely pagans. And this is something that's acknowledged by the Beowulf poet. So during the time of the story, these guys are all pagans. By the time the poem itself is composed, the poet is clearly a Christian, and the poet's audience is clearly Christian. So when people are looking for some sort of pagan overtones or pagan coloring or something along those lines, they're really trying to dig through centuries of Christianization. Not a little bit, but a lot of Christianization. This is not like, oh, my father was a worshiper of the Norse gods. No, 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 no. It had been a long time. Then we move from that to the manuscript. Now, Beowulf comes to us in only one manuscript, and we're pretty confident in dating that to the beginning of the 11th century. We'll say around 1000 AD, or just after 1000 AD. Right? That's the only place it comes to us. That's it. By 1000 AD, we are about almost half a millennium into the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons. So, the person who's copying this story down and the audience that's reading it, from their view, the Christian elements are the only true elements. The rest of it is just sort of weirdness from some ancient time. So I think there are really two ways of looking at this. One way, which is valid but not my preferred way, one way is to say, well, there are these echoes of a pagan past in there. And that definitely must be, in some small sense, true. Because even if, Hrothgar and Higelac and those historic figures, even if those people were not particularly interested in religious matters, that's the social context that historically they lived in. The other way to look at it is to say, well, hold on. The poem we have, that was composed by a Christian for a Christian audience. And they already clearly don't think that that's true. And I would say, to go even farther and say, it's true to say that it's possible, in fact likely, that there are many other Beowulf poems out there, many other versions of this that are perhaps different in greater or lesser degree, and perhaps many different stories and legends about Beowulf, but none of those come to us. The Beowulf poem, the one that we have, is the one found in the one manuscript. That's the only one we have. The others are all speculative. So, while it can sometimes be a fun game that people play on the internet to kind of speculate about pagan elements in Beowulf, truthfully, I think that it's really not a fruitful area to look at. Instead, I think it's helpful just to say, Beowulf is a Christian poet writing for a Christian audience, and the characters in there happen to be characters who come out of a pagan past. Thanks for listening.